MSNBC's The Reid Report. Joy Reid has made quite an impact on our nation. She encourages her viewers to read between the lines and to actively pursue the truth and interact with her as readers on social networks. In 1947, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, and I quote, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." I firmly believe that the education that Joy Reid received as a 1991 graduate of Harvard University with a concentration in film, as well as her elite service as a 2003 Knight Center for Specialized Journalism Fellow, equipped her with the ability to think intensively and to think critically. However, it is her character that empowers her to speak intensively and to speak critically about matters of social justice, equality, and unity. From topics on censorship to coverage on police target methods. From topics on terrorism to coverage on politics. Joy Reid stands in a class of her own, unashamedly living and reproducing the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Not simply thinking and speaking, but actually striving to do the work. From her prior tenure as the managing editor of thegrio.com to her service as the press aide in President Obama's final 2008 campaign in Florida, her writings and upcoming documentary work, there is no doubt why she has been chosen at a time like this to speak and to address the people of Columbus, Georgia. She is a woman on the front lines of journalism, utilizing her gifts, her knowledge, and her character to keep the dream of Dr. King alive. Ladies and gentlemen, neighbors and friends, I introduce and present to you none other than Mrs. Joy Reid.
Thank you so much, Pastor Conitras, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, Columbus. Oh, y'all already fired up, because usually I have to repeat it. You get into audience, you say hello, they say hello. Fired up. Ready to go. All right. Well, you know, I wrote a really great speech, and I'm just going to tell you it is really wonderful. Miss Jan knows that I wrote a really great speech, but after all that I've seen and felt today, I'm just going to talk to y'all if that's okay. Is that all right? Is that all right? Is that all right? And I want to first I have to thank your mayor, Mayor Tomlinson, for the wonderful greeting. Miss Judy, Miss Jan. I'm so bad with remembering names, but Mr. Hewley, Ms. Hewley. You guys have a wonderful team of leaders. So thank you all for the great welcome to Columbus today. And I'll tell you, I think we have our officer candidates. They look so sharp back there. What's up? We got rival bands. I saw one in green. I saw one in blue, all coming together here to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. All right. And it's a wonderful thing that I like about Columbus, and the thing that I've discovered already, my husband and I just being here literally just since last night, is that you guys have an incredible cohesion and a sense of family, and I think that's terrific. But what I've actually seen just from being on this stage today is really kind of going to inform what I'd like to talk to you guys about briefly, if I may. And I want to start with that national anthem that we heard sung so beautifully. Do you guys agree with me that was moving and beautiful? But if you ever actually think about the words in the national anthem, it's about war, it's about rockets' red glare and bombs bursting, it's about violent, right? Change. Okay, it speaks to the convulsive power of change. The convulsion that it required to rip this colony away from the people who believe they own this colony, right? The convulsive power of change. That's what that song speaks to. And then y'all brought the steppers up, made me follow the steppers. They got up and they said, we might be little, but we step real. Okay, so I'm like, okay, I can follow them. Right? But in addition to being incredible, something I know I couldn't do, especially not in these shoes, but what they spoke to, and what I think is important to remember, and we have young people here, is the youthful energy that is required for change. And that doesn't mean you have to be young, but the youthful power of change. You have to remember, Dr. King was only in his 30s when he was at the height of his power in this country. Only in his 30s, a very young man, like Beyonce's age young. Yeah, when he was at that, well, she's actually at the height of her power too, but he was at the height of his power in his 30s. And that speaks to the youthful energy that is required for change. You have to have the energy to make a change happen and stick, right? And then there's the thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about originally, which is the collaborative power of change. Because a lot of people talk about Dr. King like it was just Dr. King and everybody else looking at him like, what are we going to do next, Dr. King? How are we going to fix this? It was a group of leaders. The change that took place, not to take away from Dr. King, because he obviously was the most important and centralized figure, because the powers that be, the governmental power, needed negotiating partners. And so they chose Dr. King as one of those key negotiating partners, and he understood the power of letting power know who's outside. When power understands that they've got to negotiate with you because outside is the revolution, outside might be people who aren't willing to negotiate, who are urgent and who are desiring change now, the negotiation becomes a little bit more possible. But the collaborative power of change means that Dr. King was not walking alone. You can't send any man out alone. You saw the danger to his life that unfortunately took his life, and he really wasn't even alone. So there has to be a collaborative nature to change, a collaborative power to change. So let's now talk about this Selma to Montgomery March. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Selma. Anybody seen it? Okay, you're going to see it this weekend. I won't do any spoilers, but you already know what happened. It's a historical film.
Right.
Let's go back and talk about the times in which Selma happened. I'm going to try to make this mic work so I'm not like me popping into it. 1963. You heard Dr. King talking about Alabama, right over the Chattahoochee River from where we are right now. 1963, two students, young people, tried to go to school. They just wanted to go to school, the University of Alabama. The governor, the ultimate governmental power in the state of Alabama, physically stood in the doorway and said, no, you can't come into this school. At that time, the violence that was sweeping this country meant that only 2%, for instance, in Mississippi, of African Americans were registered to vote. It was literally a life-risking attempt to try to just simply vote. At the time when President Kennedy gave his speech, he gave it in response to the fact that the power in Alabama had stood against two individual students to prevent them from going to school. Literally 24 hours after John F. Kennedy, after being pushed, not just by Dr. King, but by multiple leaders, the NAACP, SNCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Urban League, leaders pushing him to do a civil rights bill, that was the final straw. He finally announces the bill. Within 24 hours, Medgar Evers is dead, killed in his own driveway. And do you guys, pop quiz, do you guys know who was the NAACP field director in this state at the same time that Medgar Evers was field director in Mississippi? Does anybody know? There's no prize for it. Vernon Jordan. Vernon Jordan, who was at the time the field director of the NAACP in Georgia and who went on to become the most influential counselor to a president. That's change. That's power. Not long after that, 2 months later, the March on Washington happened, not because the marchers wanted to back Kennedy up and support him, but they wanted to push him, to critique him. John Lewis of the great state of Georgia at that time had to be restrained from going to the March on Washington and saying to President Kennedy, not enough, not good enough. You're not doing enough to protect the lives of innocent African Americans in this country. Not good enough. He had to be restrained by Dr. King, among others, because they were in the process of a negotiation. 2 weeks after the March on Washington, what happens? A bomb goes off in a church and kills 4 little girls after the March on Washington. And yet, in December of 1964, a year later, when Dr. King is asked, did he believe that at the time a Negro could ever become president of the United States, he said yes. he said, I could see it happening even within 25 years.
Oh.
This is a year later. And in that December, he's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes, people in the South of the United States, African Americans, still couldn't have the vote. The change was seen as inadequate. And so now, the leaders of the movement had to go to a man of the South. A man they didn't know. A man they weren't sure that they could trust. But they had to collaborate with him. He was their negotiating partner, Lyndon Johnson. And so now we come to the time of Selma. Dr. King was not in Selma on March 7th when the first bloody, brutal march happened over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Does anybody know where he was?
In D.C.?
He was in Georgia. He was in Atlanta. He actually wasn't there. But because there was a negotiation that was even happening within the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement was not a monolith. King was not a dictator over a monolithic movement. John Lewis of Georgia and Fred Shuttlesworth said, we're going to march. We're going to march on our own. We're going to do this because we can't wait. We don't want to wait for that negotiation. We're marching. That bloody confrontation happens on the bridge. There were actually 3 marches on Washington. 3 marches in Selma. 3 marches over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That was the first one. Now, Dr. King, in response to that, what does he do? He sends out a telegram. There used to be a thing called telegrams. Young people, look it up. Actually, middle-aged people look it up, too. There used to be telegrams. He sends a telegram out, and he says, I need every pastor to come to Selma, Alabama. Because he understood, and in fact, Lyndon Johnson understood, the demonstrative power of all of those faith leaders coming to Selma and saying to the governor of Alabama, you cannot do that. You cannot brutalize people for being in a public space. That had power to aid in their negotiation. But the critics, now I want to come back to that movie for just a second. There's a lot of sort of back and forth over that film and controversy over the portrayal of Lyndon Johnson and the feeling that he's misportrayed as not being in favor of the march or fully in favor of the movement. Well, I've just spent a year working on a book that's not done, and it's late, and we're going to talk about that another time.
Right.
And listening to a lot of Lyndon Johnson's phone calls. Lyndon Johnson taped his phone calls. At the time between the first and second marches over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, Lyndon Johnson was arguing to the movement not to march. He was on the phone with a guy named Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers, anybody heard of him? Older folks probably a little bit. Now he's a television journalist. At the time, he worked for Lyndon Johnson. And he said, get on the phone with the Attorney General, the president said, and tell King to stand down. Now, was he telling him to stand down because he didn't believe in the cause of civic justice and civil rights? No. Did he intend to eventually do voting rights? Absolutely. But he had a little thing called Vietnam happening. He had a little thing called a budget that needed to get through. He had just ripped his party apart a year earlier to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this was not the confrontation that he wanted right then and there. In addition to that, he was supporting King and supporting the marchers by sending a friend of the court brief through a court. A court in the southern United States, a federal court that had to decide if those marchers had the right to march. So there was a collaboration, but there was also a confrontation happening between the president, Lyndon Johnson, and King. But think about the stature of Dr. King, that he is having that negotiation with the president of the United States. But in that second march, which they called Turnaround Tuesday, the confrontation that King had was not just with Lyndon Johnson, it was with John Lewis. It was with the younger members of the movement from SNCC who wanted to be more confrontational. They wanted to march again. They said, we're not going to be backed down by the governor of Alabama. We're going to march again. That was a confrontation very similar to what happened at the March on Washington, where within the movement, there was a negotiation. Within the movement, there was a collaborative process. There was no dictatorial hand down from Dr. King ordering people what to do. He was collaborating and he was negotiating both within the movement and with the power in Washington, D.C. So what happened? Turnaround Tuesday. They marched to the bridge, knelt down, and prayed. Because thousands of faith leaders had actually answered the call and come to Selma. They wanted to march too. You have all of these people, all of these expectations. The pressure is on King to go forward. But he also had a negotiation happening that maybe not everyone understood in Washington. So Turnaround Tuesday is the second march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Not even over it, but to it. But after that, What happened showed that unexpected things can happen, right? In unexpected places. A federal judge in the southern United States, a federal judge said, you do have the right, as American citizens, marchers in Selma, to march over that bridge. That judge's order, which was aided and believed in by the President of the United States, is still the law of the land that allows those Ferguson marchers. Remember, they had to go to court too, to say, no, 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 you cannot evict someone from a public space. You have the right to march. That came from Selma. So the third time, on March 25th in 1965, 50 years ago, when the march from Selma to Montgomery actually happened, it wasn't a few thousand people. It was tens of thousands. It was one of the largest marches that had happened in this country. And it was successful, and within weeks, Lyndon Johnson went back to Congress and announced that he would put forward a Voting Rights Act. It was a direct result of the confrontational power of the civil rights movement, of the collaborative power and wisdom of a Dr. King, who understood that you had to have both. You had to have confrontation and you had to have collaboration in order to move forward change. But it was also about the youthful vigor of those marchers who were willing to risk what had already been demonstrated just a couple weeks before, was the willingness of the powers that be in the state of Alabama to use brute force to stop those marchers. And you have to remember that these weren't just African Americans that took that risk. These were people who came from New York, from Michigan. James Reid, who was beaten to death, a white minister who answered that telegram and ended up losing his life for it. So you had people who were willing to put forward their lives and bodies to agree to the cause of equality, to the right to vote, to the basic right to register and vote. So I think that when you look in the whole at Dr. King and you look in the whole at Lyndon Johnson, those who kind of argue with the film about who's getting the credit miss the point. Because the credit is shared. The credit goes to the movement. The credit goes to Dr. King and the leaders. It goes to the ordinary people whose names we will never know. And it does go to those in power who are willing to negotiate. So I think what we need to take forward from it, now I'm going to go forward because, we don't want to stay in 1965. Although, I'm a nerd. Don't tempt me because I'll stay in 1965 for the rest of the day. So don't tempt me. There's probably a teacher in the crowd saying, keep going.
Yeah.
My mother was a teacher, so I understand.
Yeah.
What we see today happening in cities across the country, right? Is a new movement for change.
Yes.
That may not be universally believed in or accepted, but it has to be reckoned with. It has to be noticed. It is willing to be confrontational, visible. It is loosely organized, much like the movement was in the 1960s. There are no singular leaders. It's disparate. It answers back to power. When a group of these young people, who none of them were more than 25 years old, went to the White House, they didn't go to the White House to ask for anything. They didn't go to the White House to ask for direction, even to ask for legislation, to ask for help from the first black president, the man who redeemed the reality of Dr. King's belief that there could be a black president of the United States. They didn't go to ask him for everything. They went to tell him what they wanted. Because they had that youthful bravado and belief in themselves that they can make the country better, that they don't need to be led to make the country better. But they also understood that you cannot make the country better without engaging with power. You cannot just be a movement that is visible, that is loud, that makes a lot of noise, that gets on my show and on television, but that doesn't actually make something tangible happen. The march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama made legislation happen. The March on Washington in 1963 made legislation happen. Transformative, real change can be combative. It can be full of youthful vigor and energy, but it has to be collaboration. And so what I want all of you to take from this is that each of us has a part to play in fully fulfilling King's dream and fully fulfilling what this country was meant to be at the time when it ripped itself away from its colonial owners and still forgot to fully redeem the dream for the people living on its soil. It took hundreds of years just to get to the point where the original mantra of freedom that made the United States what it is was at least codified into law for everybody. So nothing happens quickly, nothing's going to happen quickly, but as long as people are willing to put themselves forward in the interest of change, as long as people are willing to work together, to collaborate with one another, and to believe in the process of change, and to engage with power, not just holler at power, then there is a possibility that 50 years from now, the speaker at the Columbus, Georgia, MLK Day tribute will talk about a new civil rights movement, a new movement to further perfect this union. So I want to thank you all for having me today. I'll mail anyone my speech who wants its original one because I didn't give it, but it's all good. Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
Give it up for Joy Reid. Give it up for Joy Reid. Clap louder for Joy Reid. Clap for free. Clap don't cost you anything. Clap louder. We'd like to bring to the stage now the Unity Choir.